The podcast ecosystem is very open. So there's just a ton of content and it's accessible to these English speaking markets. Whereas some of the other markets where they don't speak English or they have less English speakers, all of that podcast content isn't necessarily available to them. And that's a natural barrier.
Hey gang, it's Monday, October 18th somehow. Peter, and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily eMarketer podcast made possible by Newstar. I'm Marcus and today I'm joined by two Peters, both of them senior forecasting analysts. We have with us Peter Vahle. Hello, Peter.
Hey, Marcus.
Hello there. And also Peter Newman. Hello, Peter.
Hey, Marcus. Great to see you.
There they are. They will be referred to as Vahle and Newman, not just for this podcast, but forever. Forever and always. That's how their parents will refer to them and everybody else until forever. Today's fact is where we begin. This is insane. The brain itself feels no pain. Though the brain controls the pain you feel throughout your body, the brain itself has absolutely zero pain receptors. According to Alan I. Basbaum, a professor of anatomy at the University of California, San Francisco, that's why craniotomy, or brain surgery, can be done with the patient wide awake. Who is opting for that? Anesthesia, sir? No. I want to be awake for this. I'll take the anesthesia. Thank you. I'll take extra. Okay, the guy who opted to not have any, I'll take his. It's insane. Crazy fact too. Anyway, today's real topic. What new forecasts have we been working on in Q3? So, we're talking all about forecasts today. What has our forecasting team been cooking up in the kitchen? Well, in Q3, they've done entirely too much again. AVOD viewers and supported video on demand folks, we have some new numbers on them. Digital brokerage users, we've got new numbers on them. Restaurant delivery sales, we've got numbers on those too, and much, much more. But three we're going to dive into today are global podcast listeners, they're brand new. 5G subscribers, they're brand new, and also connected car people. So we'll start with global podcast listeners. Peter, so you base this on 18 markets, right? That we're covering here, and 400 million was the headline figure. 400 million worldwide, well, 380, nearly 400 million worldwide podcast listeners this year, and 500 million by 2024. How did you get to this number and your thoughts on this number?
Yeah, and that's among the 18 markets that we do publish, which is a good balance across the globe. We have the US and Canada. We have 3 countries in Latin America, 3 countries in Asia Pacific, and a handful of countries in Europe. So that's 18 markets total. And really, we just used our standard forecasting methodology, using local sources, using global reports, talking to various people in the industry. And we're able to break out podcast listeners and digital audio listeners for 16 brand new markets. We previously had forecasts for the US and UK, but 16 new markets. So this was a really exciting global expansion for our podcast forecast.
And so I was wondering, I was like, okay, 18 countries is a worldwide number. How many people are we talking here? So I counted. I took the 18 markets that you cover and I counted how many people are in each of those countries. It's 2.7 billion people because you've got China in there. And so we're basically talking 34% of the world's population within these 18 markets. So it is a sizable amount of folks that we looked at in terms of how many people around the world listen to podcasts.
Yeah, that's right. We don't have India and we don't have Russia and some other markets that, have huge populations. We do think that their podcast listening adoption is behind some of the leaders in some of the countries that we've looked at here. But we can't say that this is a true worldwide forecast. But as you said, we have a pretty good and representative list of countries here to look at and gain insights from.
Absolutely. So talk to me about who we found to be some of the most prevalent podcast listening countries.
Yeah, so looking at the top 5 or 6 countries by penetration, the US is number 1 with the highest podcast listening penetration of all of the 18 markets we looked at 40% of internet users this year. Behind them are a couple Nordic countries. Sweden is number 2 at 35%, Norway number 3 at 34%, and then Australia 33%, and then Canada, and then Spain. All of those 6 are the only countries that are above 30% in terms of penetration.
So you've got in there, as you said, the US, Sweden, Norway, Australia, Canada. Then we go, they're all, 33% and above, 40% for the US, number one. Then we go Spain, 30, Denmark and Finland each with 28, Mexico in 9th, and the UK in 10th. They've got about 25%. So the top 10, all within the 25 to 40% range. So if you were to summarize those countries in the top 10, you've got North America, US, Canada, Mexico. You've got the Nordics, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Finland. And then you've got UK, Spain, and Australia. Anything jump out to you about those countries? Any surprises when you did all the research for this and those were the countries that fell out in the top 10?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting findings with this project is how big of a factor language plays in the podcast market.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, if you look at the top 5 markets, all of them are either English-speaking countries or countries with high levels of English proficiency. So why is that? Because a ton of the content, a vast majority of the podcast content is in the English language, and it comes from the US. The US is the leader in the podcast market, and there's just been an explosion in content available. And that's really available to the rest of the world. The podcast ecosystem is very open. So wherever you are, you can pretty much access this podcast content on whatever internet connected device you have. So there's just a ton of content and it's accessible to these English speaking markets. Whereas some of the other markets where they don't speak English or they have less English speakers, all of that podcast content isn't necessarily available to them. And that's a natural barrier. And that's why we actually see, if you look at the other end of the spectrum where South Korea, Japan, and China have the lowest penetration rates for podcast listening, those languages aren't very global, right? So, and there's a couple of different reasons why those countries are lagging in podcast adoption. But one of the big reasons is that a lot of their population can't access the huge library that exists in the rest of the world.
Also really interesting how those top 5 countries are all really high income countries. There's some interesting correlation going on there that basically countries with wealthy citizens are the ones who are actually consuming podcasts, even though it's generally a free medium.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And Vahle, in your research, you noted as well that there are also high smartphone penetration markets as well, because smartphone penetration greatly linked to podcast listenership.
Yep, that's exactly right. Both of those points are entirely true. And then just to add on to the language point, if you look at number 6, so after those 5 top markets that we just talked about, it's Spain. And what does Spain have that a lot of the other countries in Europe doesn't? It's that they can access all of the podcast content that comes from Latin America and other Spanish-speaking countries. So Spain is actually the leader of all of the EU5 countries. So it has higher penetration than UK, Italy, Germany, and France, and by a fair margin.
So, as you mentioned, on the other end of the scale, the least penetrated countries, South Korea, Japan, China, each with less than 12% of internet users in those countries listening to podcasts, which suggests that there's huge potential still out there in the world. Vahle, I noted as well that Canada will have the 3rd highest share by 2023, which was one of your highlights. So right now it's in 5th place. It's going to move up into 3rd place. Was that the most interesting growth story, moving from 5th to 3rd, or was there another country that stood out when it came to the country that's going to grow the most?
The most interesting growth story is definitely with China. Right now, China has the lowest penetration rate of all the countries, but by far the highest growth rate this year. Podcast listeners in China will grow 25%. So a big increase over 2020. And if we just look at listeners overall, China has the 2nd most podcast listeners. So even though their penetration is so low, it's a massive country. There are a lot of podcast listeners in China just because of the market dynamics. So as China keeps growing, it's a market that can't be ignored.
All right, Newman, you're up. Let's talk some 5G. So 5G comes after 4G. It's faster mobile internet. It was supposed to be here a while ago. It's kind of here. If you believe the mobile carriers, it's been here for years. What are we measuring here?
We're looking at total 5G subscriptions, actually. So, we're trying to capture those couple of people who have multiple phones or who have a work phone and their other phone. So we're looking at the total number of open subscription lines, essentially, that people have with the various wireless carriers.
Okay. And so how many people have a 5G subscription this year?
So this year, we are at 48 million 5G subscriptions in the US. That's out of 367 million total wireless subscriptions, though. So 5G is still just making up a fairly small share of the total number of active subscriptions that are going.
Right.
It's growing massively year to year. It's coming from a tiny base, and it's up to 13% of all US wireless subscriptions this year are going to be 5G connections by the end of the year, once everybody buys their Vahle iPhones and upgrades from their 3-year-old phone.
Right.
But it's still just a small part of the market. It's not everybody yet. It's not going to actually be even a majority of users, we forecast, until 2024, when 5G phones will jump up to 58.7% of all phone subscriptions in the US.
But that's quite soon though, isn't it? If you think about it. And the growth, as you mentioned, just astronomical. Last year, it was about 17 million. So it's nearly 3 times the number of 2020. Mm-hmm. That 48 million is going to nearly double by next year to 90 million. And then nearly double again the next year, 2023, to reach 170 million. And then, as you mentioned, 2024 is when 5G devices, as you point out in your notes, will account for over half of all wireless devices in the US, reaching that 59% mark.
A lot of this is not even going to be people who are really making a conscious choice, like they want a 5G phone. It's if you're going shopping this year and you have an old iPhone, you are going to buy a 5G phone. And if you enter into most places by now, something like 225 million people live in areas in the US covered by 5G already. So nearly 2/3 of the population, if they get a 5G phone, are going to be connecting to a 5G network. So these 5G devices are just becoming the norm. The carriers and the tech providers are pushing 5G to be just the de facto standard, the default. So if you get a $300 phone at this point or anything more expensive, it's going to be a 5G phone. If it's not, it's making news in the tech blogs.
It sounds like the smart TV effect, basically. You buy a new TV, there's a good chance it's going to be internet connected, and therefore smart TV penetration rates go up.
Exactly.
Just because. You mentioned carriers. I mean, every carrier would have you believe that they are the 5G carrier. But who is in front in terms of 5G subscriptions?
So Verizon is the largest carrier in the US, does have the most 5G users. But interestingly, T-Mobile, which rolled out its 5G network earliest of all in the US and has had a wider ranging coverage for more years, still has a higher share of its users on 5G than either Verizon or AT&T. So T-Mobile has nearly 18% of its subscribers accessing 5G networks. That's compared to 13% for the country as a whole. And Verizon, we're looking at 14.5% 5G penetration. And that's leaving out AT&T, which is in the middle between the two.
Okay, interesting. South Korea, if I'm not mistaken, was the first kind of 5G country, right? They were kind of rolled out during their Winter Olympics in 2018.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. Are they still out in front? And what do we have to look forward to based on how far along they are with 5G?
So South Korea is still ahead in penetration. They rolled out their networks, like you said, in April 2019 when they had the first wide-ranging 5G deployment. And that flipped it on nationwide on one day, a couple days before schedule, because they really wanted to beat a Verizon test project. But yeah, South Korea's 5G users have been growing very rapidly. They reached 22.8 million 5G subscriptions this year. By next year, that'll rise to 35 million, which will be nearly half of the population. That'll be 48% of all of their subscriptions using 5G. And by 2025, we have that up at nearly 3 and 4. So people buy devices slightly more regularly in South Korea than they do in the US. So the replacement just keeps coming, and that is building their base of 5G users very rapidly.
Okay. And finally, on 5G, is there something that when people get 5G, they start using more, or they start using for the first time? Is there a kind of a killer app, if you will? It could be an existing app, which people just, maybe people are just watching so much more digital video, consuming more music, on social networks more, browsing the internet, shopping. Is there a certain thing people are doing more with 5G?
So nothing as of yet. That's kind of been the big question that's going over the entire mobile space. So 5G is going to be a game changer for industrial applications. It's going to be a game changer for businesses. But for consumers, for people, there hasn't been anything that they can really use it for that was completely impossible before. Now, of course, that's also been amplified through the last year and a half as people have not been traveling nearly as much. They haven't been out and about needing their blazing fast mobile connection in the same way as before. But that's been a source of dissatisfaction, actually, in a lot of survey data that we've seen. So people are not actively looking for a 5G device because they've either heard from their friend, heard from their relative it doesn't do much. It's just a phone. It's still doing the same things. It's still loading the same pages.
Right.
Still watching the same videos. With a tiny device, your TikTok video is not going to get that much sharper.
Right. People, like you said, business purposes, people more likely to use it for Internet of Things, for autonomous vehicles, things that use the internet around us but aren't necessarily our smartphone. Final point on this I found was interesting. There are still some Americans using 3G, 6%. That nearly vanishes next year, right?
There are a few, but if you are one of those few, you look out in the mail because your carrier has probably sent you something saying this network is being deactivated. My AT&T tried to send my mom a new phone because they thought she was still using some old flip phone that she'd bought from them years ago, and was connecting to a 3G network that is not going to be operating anymore. They're actually shutting them down to devote more spectrum, more wireless airwaves to 5G. So next year in the US and really across the world, by the end of next year, 3G and 2G and anything older is just going to be completely a thing of the past.
It's gone. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Next year, 71% roughly of folks on 4G, about 25% on 5G. Let's move on to connected cars. Oscar Roscoe, one of our directors of forecasting, was the lead on this, but Newman, you helped him out. First of all, what is a connected car? What are we talking about?
So a connected car is any car that has a built-in system that you can interact with and that connects wirelessly to the internet. So it either can connect through your phone and with Android Auto or Apple CarPlay and use that to display some apps on a screen and connect to the internet and bring the internet to you. Or it can do it all on its own. It can have a touchscreen and its own internet connection, and you can interact with music, with other services through the car itself.
Okay, and so a number of people who are connected car drivers, as a percentage of the people who are licensed drivers, 60% this year. And it basically changes 3 points each year, whether you go forward or backwards. If you go backwards, it was 57% the year before, 54%, 51, 47, 44 by the time you get to 2016. If you go forwards from 2021, you take that 60%, you go 63, then 66, then 68. Can we explain this kind of very steady growth, but not exponential growth by any stretch of the imagination, in the number of folks who are connected car drivers?
So, yeah, that's actually kind of a similar story too with 5G, actually. If you're in the market for a car now, I went and got a new car a couple months ago. You can't find anything that's not connected anymore. And that's been the case for a few years now. If you're getting a new car, it's a connected car. So what we're basically seeing here is old cars getting driven off the road, old cars being sold and being junked and being replaced with newer cars that feature this connectivity.
And there's two ways to connect, right? You can have something that's already embedded, or you can tether your device.
That's right. You could either have the embedded connection from the car's built-in infotainment system, and it has its own connection to the internet that you're able to stream through if you're willing to pay however much your car maker actually charges for that. Or you can hook up your own phone to it. Apple has CarPlay, which is its own operating system that then mirrors your phone basically on your car screen. And Google has its own thing with Android, a similar thing. And that's available on almost every car nowadays too. So most cars, you have the option to use either one. We find that there are more people who are using what we call these tethered systems, connecting their phones, than we have people who are using just the system that comes built in with the car. This year, there are 83 million people who are tethering their phone and connecting their car that way, connecting through their smartphone to the car, while there are 57 million people who are using the actual car systems to do that.
I found that fascinating, that this year 60% will tether, 40% will use the embedded system. But even in 4 years' time, it's still going to be most people who are tethering their phone. 55% of people are still tethering their phone versus the 45 who are going to be using the embedded system. I would have thought that would have replaced, especially within 4 years' time. So just astonishing how slow that is, how much time that is taking.
Well, a lot of the time when you're driving, you want to just have your phone plugged into charge. And it just pops up then.
Interesting.
So might as well use that. It also, it's a little more personalized, especially if it's a car you share with a family member. Your phone is your own personal, has your own personal settings, has your own personal collection of music, rather than necessarily needing to use profiles on a car. That's a nightmare to try to navigate those systems. And Yeah, so you're going to see this continuing. Apple and Google are both trying to make themselves bigger players in the car, and they're making it simpler to use CarPlay and to use Android Auto.
Right. So whether I'm plugging my phone in or using Bluetooth, they're both still tethering.
That's right.
Okay. All right. That's all we've got time for the lead story. Time now for the halftime report. Newman and Vahle, you're going to give us your takeaways, a quick 20-second takeaway from each of the forecasts that you worked on. We'll start with Vahle. Global podcast listeners, Vahle, what's your main takeaway?
The main takeaway is that the US is the global podcast leader right now in terms of overall listeners and penetration rate. And there's a big discrepancy between English-speaking markets such as the US, Australia, Canada, and even the Nordics, and APAC markets such as South Korea, Japan, and China, who are playing catch-up really when it comes to podcast adoption. And if you want to learn more about this forecast and the trends in the global podcast market, check out our report that's coming out later this week.
All right, Newman, 5G, one takeaway.
5G globally is just sweeping across markets, whether consumers like it or not. They're not finding that much of a benefit to it, but it's the default. And within 2 or 3 years, it's going to be the majority of ways cell phones connect.
And for connected cars?
If you're looking for a car in the US, it's going to be a connected car, whether you really seek it out or not, but you're still going to be plugging in your phone for the most part to have your own personalized connected car experience.
Well, that's global podcast listeners, 5G. That's connected cars. They also covered AVOD viewers, digital brokerage users, restaurant delivery sales, and so much more in Q3. In Q4, the team's already working on US fashion resale sales and users, bank fraud losses, loan volumes by type, and more, mortgage and student loans and things like that. So it's too many forecasts being worked on at the moment. You can check those out if you're a pro subscriber. Head to eMarketer.com. Don't forget that bit is key. All right, that's all we've got time for the lead story. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, Newstar. Are you prepared for marketing's next chapter? You won't want to miss Brave New Worlds 2021, the virtual marketing and analytics event of the year, on November 9th and 10th. Join Brave New Worlds to learn how you can adapt to the forces redefining advertising. It's free, and you'll hear from today's top minds in marketing, data, and analytics, including executives from Facebook, General Motors, Capgemini, Publicis, and more. Go to bravenewworlds.newstar to register today. All right, folks, we are back today in other news. How receptive to ads are heavy podcast listeners, the internet's paid layer, and some new audio glasses. Story 1. Heavy podcast listeners aren't just tuning into content, they're receptive to ads too, writes Hoang Nguyen of YouGov. Who are heavy podcast listeners? They're folks who listen to podcasts 2 or more days a week, which is 14% of American adults or 37 million people. They tend to be between 25 to 45 years old, skew male somewhat, and their number one category by a long shot is news and politics. How do they feel about ads exactly? Well, 6 out of 10 of them were willing to listen to ads. 25% found them intrusive, but listened anyway. Number 2, 25% of heavy podcast listeners like when brands engage with them with ads on podcasts, just behind other advertising channels like online and TV, 31 and 26% respectively. Number 3, 6 out of 10 heavy listeners use an ad blocker while using the internet, over-indexing against the average American. So podcast ads could be a way to reach them. And number 4, 2/3 of heavy podcast listeners say they love recommending things for people to try. Vahle, you're up on this one. Heavy podcast listeners, what are your thoughts?
So it's great that a lot of the information cited in this article really confirms previous research. A lot of these data points confirm things that we've talked about before on this show. I think it's interesting that Nielsen also had a recent report talking about how a lot of podcast listeners today are light listeners, meaning they don't listen every day or even a couple times a week. They just might listen once a week or once a month. And I think that's normal given that podcast listening is a relatively new consumer behavior. You know, the more people get adjusted to listening to podcasts, the more and more they'll actually listen to once they are able to discover things they like. The only other thing that I'll say that really stood out to me is that 6 in 10 heavy listeners say they do not trust traditional TV advertising. That's really interesting. And it shows that people, and it kind of gets to the core of why podcast advertising is received better than a lot of other types of advertising. We've seen that in survey after survey that people are a lot more open to podcast ads because they have more of an intimate relationship with the host, or, the ad is very on brand. So it's finding them in an environment where they're willing to listen, basically.
Yeah. Some research from Jacobs Media, though, from May of this year showed that 51% of US podcast listeners will skip ads a lot of the time versus the 37% who said it's rare that they skip them. Story 2. Media that were once free or easily accessible, think news websites, podcasts, TV shows, and games, rushed to get behind paywalls during the pandemic, writes Neil Rothschild and Sarah Fisher of Axios. Just as cable introduced a paid layer to TV in the 80s, the internet's paid layer is taking shape 40 years later. The Axios piece notes that new data from publisher subscriptions company Piano shows the rate at which users saw a paid offer or were asked to pay for content on a news website doubled during COVID. Pew Research Center also notes that for the first time last year, newspapers made more money from subscriptions than from ads. Readers are also being asked to pay to read individual writers who are leaving news organizations for independent writing platforms like Substack. Newman, your thoughts on the internet's paid layer?
So a lot of this was spurred on just when there was so much uncertainty throughout last year with what the ad market looked like. Will there be an ad market? How will we be bringing in our revenue? And that made a ton of sense at that point to shift more to subscription models. People also in the US, especially, there were people who had more cash than they were used to with stimulus checks going out with enhanced unemployment. So there was an appetite for paying for things, for seeing that the people who you wanted to create the content that you liked were able to continue to do so and getting paid. How that's going to continue through the next year, as we're going to be showing soon, is rebounding and is going strong. That's a bit different question, because we're already seeing in the video space, the extent to which things are fragmenting is making it so we're almost going to need cable bundles to come back, essentially, with all these streaming services. Are we going to see that with news, or is there going to be a place for the likes of Apple with their news aggregation and other content aggregators to really step in and get everything together so that people don't need to be subscribing to 16 different things at once?
On the streaming services, since March 2020, the number of folks who were willing to pay for more than 5 streaming services grew from 9% to 16%, according to Magid's latest video entertainment study. Also, another point from Axios was the creation of the internet's paid layer may never crowd out free alternatives, but it threatens to leave society with even fewer shared reference points. Story 3. Electronics company Anker has just announced some new audio glasses from their Soundcore brand. The new glasses, priced at $200, will be available in November and come in 10 different lens styles that you snap onto the glasses' arms, because the arms have the speakers built in, so they always stay the same, and you just replace the lenses with whichever style you want. Chris Welch of The Verge notes that there are 2 speakers on each temple or arm, and in most cases outside, most people won't notice that your glasses are playing music. But if you've got the volume up inside, there'll be some sound leakage to those nearby. You get nearly 6 hours of battery life with continuous playback, and the Soundcore frames are IPX4, whatever that means, water resistant. Polarized blue light filtering and prescription lens options will also be available. Vahle, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on these glasses?
Yeah, my quick reaction is that whether or not this is meant to be a replaceable for earbuds and hearables will, I think, determine the success of these audio glasses, because I think that people have a limited capacity for how many different audio devices, they need. If someone has a great pair
they
of
want to put on their
AirPods,
face.
If someone's happy with their AirPods, you really need to go get a pair of glasses that specifically is designed to play music in your ears. It's just another thing to charge. So I think it really depends on whether this is meant to replace hearables. If it is, then maybe it has a chance.
Newman?
I really struggle to see the market for this, because for people who, like me, don't need prescription glasses, I'm not going to necessarily plunk down $200 for a pair of glasses that my daughter might grab and break next week. And then for my wife, who needs her glasses, she is not going to necessarily be restricting herself, or she won't want the things she depends on to see to need to be plugged in every night. You won't want something that core to your functions to be tethered to a power outlet.
Good points. That's what we've got time for today's episode. Thank you to my guests. Thank you, Vahle.
Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Thank you, Newman.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun.
And thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by New Star.